I do want to introduce Dr. Ronald Trosper. He's a professor of Indigenous economics at the University of Arizona and a member of the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana. His PhD degree is in economics from Harvard University in 1974, but he has been a multidisciplinary scholar, publishing in American Indian Studies, Ecological Economics, Economics Policy Studies, Forestry, Anthropology, and has worked outside of the academy for the Council of Energy Resources Tribes in the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes. Welcome, Ron. Thank you so much for joining us.
And I'd like to thank the organizers for arranging this. We had a pothole in Tucson in the runway of the airport, and so the plane couldn't take off, and I missed all my connections. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's really wonderful. I was thinking, well, gee, why should I go to another boring ecological economics conference? Why don't I just stay home and be on the screen with Zoom? I'm glad I came, because it's been a wonderful conference. And I wondered when I came here, well, which traditional territory is it? And it's three. The Neutral, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe people have all used this area. And I also was very pleased. The first person I met told me he was using my book as a textbook. So I wrote this book, Resilience, Reciprocity, and Ecological Economics. And apparently it's beginning to spread around. My little royalty statement came in, and it was more than usual by a little bit. And I'm working on another book, Principles of Indigenous Economics, or you could call it Indigenous Economic Theory, which I'm going to give you the basics of what's going to be in the book in a few minutes. So we know that the Haudenosaunee utilized the two-row wampum belt. We had the ship on one side and the canoe on the other, and an agreement between them, the covenant chain, allowed trade while each went along autonomously. But that's not how the history worked out. We know about settler-colonialism. But I think that now the principles of indigenous economic theory need some articulation and exploration. And so I say that indigenous economic theory is grounded in an indigenous worldview that relationships are primary, and I'll talk about what a relationship means, and land and all its components are conscious and able to respond in their own manner to the actions of humans. For example, the Western concept of natural resource management could be restated as building healthy relationships with everyone in our territory, with everyone understood to mean all conscious beings in the place. Whereas standard economics considers individuals the basic unit of analysis, indigenous economics considers relationships as the basic units of analysis. Persons do not stand alone. They depend on their relationships. They create them and act in the context of them. Just to start off, there's three examples, most from Canada, that illustrate these principles. The indigenous people of the Northwest Coast prospered because of relationships with salmon, as I explain in my book. They learned from the salmon that giving to others is good. And for the gift of salmon lives, the peoples cared for the rivers, the streams, the lakes that were the home of the salmon on land. They harvested the salmon wisely with respect. A second example is indigenous peoples who supplied the fur trade based on relationships in the hunting territories in what became Canada. The fur trade was based on solid relationships between humans and beavers. The indigenous beaver stewards of the boreal forest harvested neither too much nor too little in their relationship with beaver. The beaver, from its viewpoint, gave the right amount of their lives to have the humans tend their home range. In both examples of the first two here, humans and animals engaged with each other in a mutually beneficial relationship, which, by the way, challenges the idea of wild. Now, the third example is the Haudenosaunee League, which created peace among 5 separate nations using effective treaty-making principles to eliminate wars. The League was a relationship of relational units. Each of the nations were also based on village relationships. The example shows that relationality can be scaled up. It is not just a small-scale or local phenomenon. In building the covenant chain with European settlers, the Haudenosaunee demonstrated that international relations could be structured using their methods of maintaining peace. And I see that we're at the Center for International Governance and Innovation. And one of the innovations that I'm hoping they're considering is the Haudenosaunee system of peacemaking. I'll repeat that people often criticize people who talk about reciprocity and sharing as not being scalable. And so the Haudenosaunee is an example that we can use. You had villages, and you had nations, and you had the League itself, and then you had relationships with Europeans, so it was definitely scalable. When many entities create one or more relational goods shared among them, their mutual appreciation of the shared relational goods creates a relational unit. So in analyzing relationships, one has to say, well, what's the relational good that defines this relationship? And different ones, they could be ephemeral or they can be long-lasting. This relational good or goods is obtained by everybody paying attention to each other and to each other's contributions to the good that they share. The good is not available to entities not in the relationship. And furthermore, it can't be bought or sold. It exists among the people in the relationship who contribute to it and enjoy it. Some examples, and a couple or an extended family share love and affection among themselves. A group of families working together to form a clan can build trust and shared identity. The clans together can form a larger unit that also includes the beings in their place and sustained all members. Another example is a cooperative spirit among people dependent on other beings, a feeling of safety among the residents of an area, the collaborative spirit of a sports team, and the joy felt by everybody at a major feast. Maori in New Zealand offer the concept of mana, a power generated by the joint cooperative action of many conscious beings. And of course, peace among nations is a relational good. Now, once we recognize that the world is composed of interacting relational units, we have a different kind of theory than that developed by standard economics, which focuses on persons as individuals capable of completely independent existence who gather together to trade products among themselves to make more products. The trades among individuals are impersonal. A modern market economy results from these trades, which are maintained through contracts enforceable by the police power of a national state. The products are made from things extracted from nature, and the waste made by the production of those things are returned to nature. We now know that the world cannot process all the waste produced by the production of things, and the impersonal basis of the trade removes personal responsibility for the outcomes. Beaches are covered with things washed up from the ocean. That illustrates an example, and so does the changing climate that we've been talking about at this conference. In a relationship, in contrast, the entities care for each other so that they can enjoy the benefits of working together. If joint activities make some of the participants suffer, others are concerned about the suffering because all are involved in a system of reciprocity, of jointly caring for and respecting each other's. The use of mutual reciprocity is part of the generation of relational goods. Impersonal markets generate and ignore externalities. The personalized relationships recognize externalities and act to deal with them. And so this is the basis of the fact that Indigenous peoples are so good at managing fisheries, because they know that they have relationships among themselves and with the fish, and they share the products of the fishery. They understand the importance of public goods, such as the biodiversity of the landscape, so they act to keep that public good in place, and they use their trust among themselves and the relationship among themselves to get to that point of having a proper relationship with the world around them. Now, much of the mainstream economics literature claims that Indigenous economies would benefit from privatizing land ownership within reservations in the United States. In particular, I've seen it proposed for Canada as well. This literature criticizes the 19th century policy of allotment in America for failing to correctly implement private property in land to empower individuals. In addition, mainstream economic theory holds that businesses located in Indigenous communities could be autonomous. They should not be tribally controlled, and they should follow the corporate top-down model, with weak relations to the communities in which they exist, free from politics. These arguments reflect a long-standing perception that tribally run firms are inefficient and prone to political influence. If you have really good relationships, you have to maintain those relationships. They're probably more valuable than the maximum profit of the firm, and that has to be taken into account. If carried to an extreme, these recommendations destroy economics based on relationality. The individualization movement that we have gotten from the settlers really has attacked the relationships that have made indigenous communities work. Also, because conscious beings should not be enslaved, ownership is not the way to organize humanity's relationship with other beings occupying a place. While people can trade products of the land, to create a market inland threatens relationships, the basis of survival. Because buying and selling land threatens relationships, when indigenous peoples must own land to protect it in the presence of settler colonialism, significant problems have to be addressed. Fully autonomous firms, possibly available for purchase by outsiders, focus only on their bottom line, ignoring significant issues relating to the communities in which they exist. And in the United States, the federal government has been encouraging tribes to set up such independent entities, and they've not succeeded. But some tribes in the United States do have an enclave, a casino or a business park, organized as standard corporation or with land leased from outside corporations. This is addressing the question of, well, how can people engaged in a relational economy deal with an individualized economy? And having enclaves and barriers is a way to do that. The hybrid element is the profit or rent from such enclaves support relationships through supporting community buildings, housing, education, language revitalization, healthcare, and similar projects. So in the United States, if you go to tribes that are well known for their casinos or their factories like in the Mississippi Choctaw, you go talk to them, they are developing their relationships with the funds that they get from those enterprises. The Menominee tribe is another example of a hybrid economy. They're protecting their forest while operating a casino and a sawmill. They have a different kind of relationship to their forest in comparison to their casino, and their forest is resilient, and it has Menominee loggers, foresters, mill workers. And unlike corporate forests, their forest has increased in standing timber volume and has a high proportion of old trees. Tribal members use the forest for products other than timber. If you have a hybrid economy, you also have to have firms that are hybrid. They must meet the demands of the external economy to be profitable enough to persist, while also build solid relationships with the community. So you have people who maybe make their living in the bush and get some fur that they can sell, but they use the profit for community-based work. Family firms should be strongly relational in their operating style, especially families working in a sector where traditional relationships to their place are dominant. And so I would expect, if we look at modern indigenous communities, you'd have a spectrum of firms from individualistic and capitalistic all the way over to really, really relational ones. Now, there's examples in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand of hybrid indigenous economies. The indigenous peoples of the Andes are asserting the importance of relationships in connection to place. They've achieved changes in national constitutions in Ecuador and Bolivia. Buen vivir, or good living, sumak causa, and so forth. These are ideas that have had real difficulty in implementation, but the indigenous communities in the Andes are pressing forward. They have a vision of a plurinational composition of their nations, not one nation, but many nations, with autonomous communities each pursuing their own relationship to their places. These proposals, I think, resemble the peace among nations that the Haudenosaunee advocated. If the constitutional provisions prevail against the extractive industries, both countries will become associations of indigenous hybrid economies coexisting with more justly organized non-Indigenous communities if those non-Indigenous communities join the system. So now we can say, we know that the ships of the two-row wampum have become larger. Some, such as oil supertankers, threaten our atmosphere and transport species to homes where they do not belong. Yet the principles that govern the canoes have survived, and we've heard many examples of that at this conference. And the biodiversity hotspots of the earth are also homes of the Indigenous peoples who are maintaining their relationships with other beings of their places. The canoes have proved themselves resilient. The supertanker's ocean threatens to engulf the continents. The wealth inequalities created by individualism threaten world peace. The principles of Indigenous economic theory need to be understood and utilized for the sake of the earth. Thank you very much. Now, I went along quickly, and I have a volunteer to help me with the questioning.
We have about 10 minutes, and we can have a little bit of discussion about the many ideas that Ron just raised very quickly. And so we don't have to, I think, go through the written questions. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand. And yes, why don't you come up here, because then it'll be on the recording.
Well, but I think there's screen issues, so I think they, yeah.
It has to be on the screen.
Thank you so much, Professor Trosper, for this inspiring talk. I would like to ask you a very specific question, which is about the hybrid economy that you're mentioning, and I don't fully understand how power asymmetries between these different firms will play out. Let me bring quickly one particular example. In Bolivia, for instance, or in Ecuador, you might say that there are different firms, some acting from a reciprocal standpoint, others very much from an individualistic profit-seeking and profit-making. However, the structuring of the firms and the structuring of the nation-state by using, even though they call themselves, Bolivia in particular, plurinational states, and Ecuador recognizing Buen Vivir and Sumak Kausai as a driving engine behind in the constitution, but they still use GDP as a measurement of progress. So I would like to ask you if the power asymmetries play any role in the dissemination, spread of reciprocal firms as wildfires in our territory, or basically they will limit that spread.
Okay.
Did I make
Well,
sense?
yes, that's clear. That's Nico raises a really crucial point, and it's one of the main things that an Indigenous community is going to have to deal with. And that is, if you have an individualistic or profit-oriented firm that's in your community, how do you keep it under control? On my reservation, we have a hydroelectric dam, which we have succeeded in purchasing from the company that had it. And we had a huge discussion when we were setting up the independent entity that would run that dam. In order to have that dam, we needed an independent entity that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission would recognize as qualified to be a utility. The Tribal Council spent many hours writing out an agreement with the leaders of that enterprise about how limited their scope of operation is. Certain things they just can't do without coming back to the Tribal Council. So if they get interested in a big biomass plant, can't do that, can't build another dam, you have to come back to the government of the community to make the decision. So I think that keeping the political power of the community dominant is extremely important, but as we all know, if you have highly profitable, individualistically oriented firms, they have extra profit, and they can use that profit to help their power, and they also have connections to national governments. So if the profit is defined as owned by the community, and the community has a say about what the surplus where the surplus goes, that will help. So but I do agree that there are really inconsistencies between the two. I do have to point out, though, that if you look into the workings of a profit-oriented, individualistically oriented firm, you discover that the workers are developing relationships. And the managers have to worry if the workers get too strong in their relationships, they might go on strike, there might be a wage demand, so that the relationships, humans like relationships. And I think even when they're in a big contract structured firm, they still develop relationships, and the firm managers have to spend some time keeping those relationships from getting too powerful. So I wouldn't say automatically that people in individualistic situations would dominate. I'm reminded of a joke. A joke just came to mind from Vine Deloria. I was told that Vine Deloria was talking about individualism, and he said, if you folks were really individualistic, we would have picked you off one at a time when you came over the mountains.
Are there any other questions or remarks? Yes, Jen, come up. I think if
Better to come up here, I think.
then you'll be on the camera.
So I've been hearing a lot about relationality and reciprocity. It's coming up in all kinds of places that I'm at lately, including here, and we have a lot to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and being, but how do settlers learn from that without appropriating? So can you just apply that to the settler economies, settler ways of structuring societies, or is there some way that's appropriative? And yeah, just want to hear about that.
What's involved? Let's look at owning land. If you have individuals own land, they own the land, they have full rights to the rent from the land, they have the right to sell it. There's lots of rights that they have. However, if you're going to have a relationship with the land and the people around, the products of the land have to be available in reciprocal relationships with other people in the community. So I think one could ask the question, if the settlers say, well, look at how those people are prosperous and how happy they are, let's copy them and make an arrangement that we won't sell our land, we'll build relationships, we'll start respecting the animals. Pretty soon, I would say they've become indigenous. So we've assimilated in the other direction. So I don't think it's really a serious issue of expropriation of the idea, because the idea is really very hard to implement. And if you do implement, you have to change your identity. You have to really think hard about it. So I don't, there's other things that get stolen, but I don't think that focusing on relationships necessarily is high on the list. More questions?
Are there other questions?
Here's one.
Oh, yes, Michelle.
So the word economics is being used quite a lot and in many different ways. In one of the previous talks, plenary sessions, we heard the notion of real economics as opposed to just financial trade or something. And real economics seem to be material economics. From Peter Soderbaum, who's an institutional economist, I learned that economics is the management of scarce resources. So that doesn't have to be monetary. I would like to know how you define the term economics.
Oh, my goodness, the final exam. First of all, let me say that when Lionel Robbins said that economics is about scarcity, he also said that man has unlimited desires, and he said that the idea of unlimited desires goes back to the Garden of Eden. So we have to recognize that there's a cultural component to economics, and in fact, I like to quote Marshall Salins, who says that the economic man is just Adam modernized, because he's the same sort of gluttonous person that they talk about in Western theology. So if you're going to change economics, you definitely have to have different kinds of persons. So I would say that I would focus on the material exchanges and the importance of managing the basic livelihood as part of economics. And so exchange and trade is part of economics. Cooperation in that way is part of it. But we don't want to include in economics assumptions about the nature of the person. So take that out. Let people trade in different ways. Don't focus on the economic model, but focus on a broader, wider concept of the person who can form relationships. And so if you talk about relational goods, economists will say, well, that sounds like a local public good where people cooperate to have a fire service for their community or another local public good. But in this case, it's not exactly a local public good because people have to participate to use it, and they can't rent it out. So it's a different kind of good. So my focus on economics would be the material relationships among people, broadly conceived, and people include beings on the land as well. So it becomes a different kind of thing, but it's still about exchange.
So that, I want to ask a question.
Go ahead.
That leads right into what I find very compelling about your book, the first book. I'm looking forward to the second one. But the first one describes very clearly the relationship between the kind of economics that you've just been talking about and the governance system and ecological system that maintain each other and allow that kind of an economics to persist and to be sustainable over time. So I wonder, for people who haven't yet had the chance to read your first book, if you could just summarize a little bit about how that works in the Northwest Coast system.
Okay, a brief summary of the Northwest Coast system. That's a final exam in 5 minutes. So the Northwest Coast peoples divided the territory into the land into territories, each of which was controlled by a house. And a house was a group of people with kinship, but they had a title holder, a set of title holders who had ultimate authority over what went on the land. So, but in order to become a title holder, you had to prove that you knew how the land operated. You had to prove that you could produce a surplus. You proved that you could produce a surplus by throwing a feast. And at the feast, you had surplus wealth that you gave to other title holders. And when they took that wealth from you, they recognized your authority over the land. And so the potlatch feasts was actually a way of different title holders recognizing each other's authority over the land. And if a title holder died and his successor, who'd been trained, took over, that successor had to take a year to collect the surplus to throw a feast. And if he couldn't throw the feast, he couldn't continue as the title holder, and they had to find somebody else. So there was a system of responsibility among the leadership to produce surplus from the land, but they also had to maintain the land. And another component that's very interesting about the Northwest Coast was the belief in reincarnation, that a title holder felt that he was or she had been in the family before and would subsequently have descendants who would be in the family. So the land would be something that was very important to preserve so that in the future it would be available for the person's descendant of himself. So and another key point that I like to emphasize is if the responsibility is placed with those title holders, there's a danger that they could become too powerful. But there were methods to keep the title holders in line. And one of the best methods was for people in a community to conspire with somebody else to come kidnap the title holder and sell him into slavery. And then the other community would offer to say, well, we'll sell him back to you. And the original community says, well, no, we don't want to buy him. And so they could replace the leadership. So the leadership was accountable to the community for maintaining the land. And this accountability part of it is really important. And in the potlatch system, the potlatches, there were people counting how much was given how much was contributed, how much was given. It was all very, very public and very accountable.
You mentioned in your book the idea of having these feasts where the chiefs would have to put on a mask and be ridiculed. It's like a total roast once a year of the chief.
Yes.
So that the chief has that experience of being the target, being marginalized, and as we know, the kinds of jokes that are brought out in a situation like that can always have an element of truth in them. So it gives the chief an opportunity to hear what people really think about what's going on, and maybe, take that under advisement. I don't know if you want to talk any more about this. Well, but it's the relationship between the governance system as, chiefs and control over the land, but actually the ecological decisions that are made to make sure that the harvest is sustainable over a long time.
Yes, well, that's a very important feature. The chiefs were responsible for maintaining the health of the land, and they had to become a chief. They had to know how the land operated. They had to show that they had a connection with this salmon. And some of this was expressed as a spiritual power or knowledge, but the point was the responsibility for maintaining the land was a community responsibility, and the leader had to do that in order to maintain his or her leadership position. And I say his or her because in the matrilineal societies, the women were responsible. A man's successor would be his oldest sister, the child of his oldest sister, the man, and so his sister would be responsible for training his successor. And so that would, there was a certain amount of spreading of the power among the genders by that method.
Do we have one final question? Anything else that pressingly needs to be said? I think we're short on time, so because of the other plenary that's starting. But I would just like to thank Ron for his willingness to do this.